suspected of leading the Blood family mafia street gang even while on the run.
Wherever he is, he seems to be pulling the strings on a lot of things.
He was Canada's most wanted man and the Hells Angels' worst nightmare. Dave "Pick" Turmel didn't just break the rules of Quebec's underworld, he shattered them. Leading the Blood family mafia, he sparked a bloody turf war that left bodies dismembered, rivals tortured, and authorities scrambling. While the Angels controlled everything, Turmel feared nothing. Then suddenly, he vanished overseas, but kept texting orders from abroad. How did this ghost outplay North America's most feared biker gang? Young and fearless.
A sweeping police crackdown on organized crime in Quebec has led to more than 30 arrests in the last week, and more are expected. Authorities say it's a blow to the Blood family mafia.
Dave "Pick" Turmel wasn't just another player in Quebec's crime scene. He was an anomaly that terrified even the most hardened criminals. Born in the late 90s with no father figure and raised in Quebec City's roughest neighborhoods, Turmel displayed an unsettling comfort with violence from his early teens. By 17, he was already orchestrating sophisticated drug operations while his classmates worried about prom dates. Police records describe a teenager who carried himself with the calculated menace of someone twice his age. One detective who tracked Turmel's early crimes noted in an internal report, "The level of violence displayed suggests either severe psychological issues or a strategic understanding of terror as a business model. Either possibility is deeply concerning." What made Turmel truly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to hurt people, it was his intelligence. While other young criminals bragged about their exploits on social media, Turmel operated with military-grade operational security. No photos, no social media footprint, not even a driver's license registered to his legal name. By 21, he had assembled a core group of equally disciplined lieutenants, forming what would later become the Blood family mafia. What made Dave Turmel truly exceptional wasn't just his brutality, it was achieving so much so young. By his early 20s, he had already mapped out a strategy to challenge Quebec's most feared criminal organization, a plan most veteran criminals would consider suicidal. His youth became a tactical advantage. While Angels leadership held meetings in known locations following established security protocols, Turmel's crew operated like digital nomads, gathering in random Airbnbs, communicating through gaming platforms, and leaving no predictable patterns. They moved with the fluid adaptability of youth rather than the calculated caution of experience. Former associates describe a leader with unnerving focus. One recalled, "Pick wasn't interested in the usual stuff, fancy cars, nightclubs, showing off. He lived like a ghost before he ever needed to run. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, then return with detailed plans for hitting Angels' territory. He was planning the war before anyone knew it was coming." This youthful fearlessness extended to his inner circle, most under 30, many with technical skills rather than traditional criminal backgrounds. They approached organized crime like a disruptive startup rather than a traditional hierarchy. While this made them reckless at times, it also made them unpredictable opponents in a world where predictability often means vulnerability. Perhaps most significantly, Turmel's youth allowed him to connect with a generation of street-level operators who felt excluded from traditional criminal advancement paths. He offered them immediate opportunity rather than years of paying dues, creating fierce loyalty among young criminals who might otherwise have remained isolated independents. At 25, Turmel was already controlling drug distribution across Quebec City's southern neighborhoods without a single arrest on his record. His organization recruited exclusively from disillusioned youth, teenagers and young adults who felt the established crime families and biker gangs had left them behind. When he turned 27, Turmel made a decision that transformed him from a successful drug dealer into Canada's most wanted man. While other criminals his age were still working their way up traditional criminal hierarchies, Turmel was preparing to challenge the most established force in Canadian organized crime. And he wasn't just willing to fight the Hells Angels, he was ready to break their most sacred rule. Broke the cardinal rule.
Canada's most wanted criminal, Dave Turmel, has been arrested in Italy. Police say Turmel is the alleged leader of the Blood Family Mafia, a street gang that has been involved in brutal drug turf wars throughout the province of Quebec. He's been wanted since July 2023 by Quebec City Police for various charges, including conspiracy, armed assault, and drug trafficking. And Interpol has even issued a red notice for his arrest to all international law enforcement if he ever resurfaced. And police sources have confirmed to Radio-Canada that he was arrested in Rome. And although we don't have any more information about his current whereabouts, Canada does have an extradition treaty in place with Italy. In December, Turmel was named Canada's most wanted by the BOLO program. This stands for Be on the Lookout. And this program works alongside the RCMP and other Canadian police forces to alert the public about dangerous criminals. And at the time, police also issued a $250,000 reward for any information that could lead authorities to his whereabouts and ultimately his arrest.
In February 2023, Dave Turmel committed what amounted to criminal suicide in Quebec's underworld. He stopped paying the Hells Angels street tax. For decades, this non-negotiable 10% cut on all criminal activity had been the cornerstone of the Angels' power across Quebec. Everyone paid, from small-time weed dealers to major trafficking operations. Everyone except Turmel. The significance of this move cannot be overstated. Since the bloody Quebec biker war of the 1990s, the Hells Angels had maintained near absolute control over organized crime in the province. Their dominance was so complete that most criminals simply accepted the tax as an unavoidable cost of doing business. The Angels had killed for far less than what Turmel was attempting. Word reached the Hells Angels leadership within days. According to law enforcement sources, the Angels initially assumed it was a misunderstanding. That someone so young would deliberately provoke them seemed inconceivable. A mid-level angel was dispatched to explain the mistake to Turmel. That enforcer disappeared. No body was ever found. For the next week, silence. Then an SUV connected to a Hells Angels stash house exploded in a meticulously planned detonation. No casualties, just a message. Turmel wasn't just refusing to pay, he was declaring war. In the unwritten constitution of Quebec's underworld, one law stood above all others. You pay the Hells Angels their tax. This wasn't just a business arrangement, it was the foundational principle upon which decades of criminal stability had been built. Every dealer, every smuggler, every criminal enterprise operating in Angels territory contributed their 10%. Those who refused disappeared quickly and permanently. Until Dave Turmel. February 2023 was when everything changed, recalled a street-level dealer who witnessed the aftermath. No announcement, no negotiation. Pick just gathered his lieutenants and told them payments to the Angels were stopping immediately. When someone asked what would happen when they came for their money, he just smiled and said, "Let them try." The audacity of this move cannot be overstated. Since the bloody Quebec biker war of the 1990s that left over 160 people dead, the Hells Angels' dominance had been absolute. Their tax wasn't just revenue, it was symbolic recognition of their supremacy. By refusing to pay, Turmel wasn't just withholding money. He was rejecting the entire power structure of Quebec's criminal hierarchy. It would be like a small business suddenly announcing they won't pay taxes to the government anymore, explained a former organized crime prosecutor. Except the government doesn't dismember people for non-compliance. The Angels did. Everyone knew this. Turmel knew this. That's what made his stand so shocking. The Angels' initial reaction was disbelief. According to intelligence sources, they assumed it was a misunderstanding, that someone so young couldn't possibly be deliberately provoking them. They sent an enforcer to clarify the situation with Turmel. That enforcer vanished. No body was ever found. Days later, an SUV connected to a Hells Angels stash house exploded in a controlled detonation. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't confusion or oversight. It was declaration of war. What made Turmel's stand truly revolutionary wasn't just refusing the tax, noted a criminal intelligence analyst. It was that he had clearly prepared extensively for the inevitable retaliation. Most criminals who challenged the Angels did so impulsively and paid with their lives. Turmel had spent months hardening his operations, securing supply chains, and training his people for conflict. This cascading effect, Other criminals, inspired by Turmel's example, created an existential threat to the Angels' business model. Their entire power structure depended on universal acknowledgement of their authority, symbolized by that 10% tax. Every week, Turmel operated without paying. Their aura of invincibility diminished. The Angels faced an impossible choice: unleash a bloody public war that would bring massive police attention, or attempt negotiation, something they'd rarely done in their history. Their hesitation became another victory for Turmel, whose brutal tactics would soon escalate the conflict beyond anything Quebec had seen in decades. The Angels faced an impossible choice: crush this upstart quickly and risk a messy public war, or attempt negotiations, something they'd rarely done in their history. Their hesitation proved costly. Within weeks, other dealers began questioning why they were still paying the Angels' tax when Turmel's crew wasn't. But challenging the Angels was only the beginning. To survive what was coming, Turmel needed to instill a level of fear that would make even the most hardened bikers think twice before striking back. That required tactics Quebec's criminal underworld had never seen before, brutality that would shock even those accustomed to violence. Brutal tactics.
CTV's Quebec Bureau Chief Geneviève Beauchemin now on the list and the rewards being offered. Jen.
Well, Sandy, the top 2 wanted men are at the heart of a violent conflict here in Quebec, but they could be anywhere.
The violence that followed Turmel's declaration of independence wasn't just criminal, it was psychological warfare. While the Hells Angels had long relied on intimidation, they typically adhered to certain unwritten rules. Bodies were disposed of discreetly, civilians were generally left alone. Their first major statement came when a mid-level Hells Angels associate was found in a downtown Quebec City parking garage. He hadn't just been killed, he'd been methodically tortured, with burn marks covering his feet and his ears removed. A video of the torture session circulated briefly on encrypted messaging apps before vanishing, just long enough to ensure every criminal in Quebec heard about it. The BFM didn't just kill their enemies, they turned them into messages, explained a forensic psychologist who consulted with authorities. They borrowed tactics from Central American gangs like MS-13 and Mexican cartels, waterboarding, dismemberment, filmed executions, but with a calculated precision that suggested these weren't rage killings. They were marketing. What truly distinguished Turmel's approach was the theatrical element. Bodies weren't hidden, they were displayed. In one particularly gruesome incident, a teenage BFM associate who had allegedly betrayed the organization was found dismembered outside a Hells Angels clubhouse in Beauce, plastic wrapped like a macabre gift. The message was unmistakable: cross us, and this happens. Law enforcement officials were stunned by the escalation. We'd seen violence between rival gangs before, said one investigator, but nothing this systematic or ritualistic. It wasn't just about killing enemies, it was about creating terror. And it was working. Perhaps most disturbing was how Turmel maintained operational discipline despite the extreme violence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses willing to talk. The BFM operated with a level of security that suggested military or intelligence training, using encrypted communications, rotating safe houses, and counter-surveillance techniques that baffled authorities. The violence that followed Turmel's declaration against the Hells Angels wasn't just criminal, it was psychological warfare. While Quebec had seen its share of gang violence over the decades, Turmel's blood family mafia introduced methods so extreme they shocked even veteran criminals and police investigators who thought they'd seen everything. The BFM didn't just kill, they created spectacles of suffering, explained a forensic psychologist who consulted on several BFM-linked homicides. They borrowed techniques from Central American cartels and combined them with a theatrical presentation that transformed violence from mere enforcement into psychological terror. Their signature approach became evident in spring 2023 when a mid-level Hells Angels associate was found in a downtown Quebec City parking garage. He hadn't been simply executed, he'd been methodically tortured over what medical examiners estimated was a 6 to 8 hour period. Burns covered his feet, his ears had been removed, and the medical examiner noted evidence of waterboarding. Most disturbing was the clinical precision. These weren't rage-driven injuries, but methodical, almost surgical torture. What distinguished BFM violence was its calculated nature, said a veteran homicide detective. Traditional gang killings are often spontaneous, emotional. These were different, staged, choreographed, designed specifically to maximize terror in whoever discovered the bodies or heard about them later. By mid-2023, a pattern had emerged in BFM operations. Victims weren't just killed, they were dismembered, burned, mutilated in ways specifically chosen to spread fear throughout criminal networks. Bodies weren't hidden, but displayed in locations guaranteed to be discovered. Outside rival clubhouses, in the trunks of cars parked at popular restaurants, or even in public spaces with minimal attempt at concealment. One particularly notorious incident involved a teenage dealer who had allegedly provided information to the Angels. His remains were found outside a Hells Angels clubhouse in Bose, dismembered, each part meticulously wrapped in plastic like a grotesque gift. A card attached reportedly read simply, "No cooperation with dinosaurs." Law enforcement noted the psychological sophistication behind these displays. The BFM understood something fundamental about fear, explained a criminal psychologist. It's not just about what happens to you, it's about what might happen. Each body they left told a story of prolonged suffering, of helplessness. The message was clear: cross us, and your death won't be quick. The escalation continued throughout 2023, with each incident seemingly calibrated to push psychological boundaries further. Victims showed evidence of increasingly elaborate torture methods, techniques that required research, specialized tools, and most disturbingly, patience. This wasn't impulsive violence, but planned, rehearsed brutality designed for maximum impact. What made their approach particularly effective was the unpredictability, noted a Quebec provincial police intelligence officer. Sometimes they'd leave bodies in public places. Sometimes they'd return victims, still alive but horrifically injured, to their homes. Sometimes they'd send photos of captives to their families or associates. There was no pattern to predict, which amplified the terror. By mid-2023, the pattern was clear. Anyone who cooperated with the Hells Angels against Turmel's organization wouldn't just die. They would suffer in ways designed to maximize fear throughout the criminal ecosystem. The psychological impact was profound. Even hardened criminals began avoiding involvement in the conflict, creating a buffer zone around BFM territory that even the Angels hesitated to breach. Then, as pressure from both law enforcement and the Hells Angels intensified, Turmel made his most surprising move yet. He disappeared overseas, leaving Quebec's underworld wondering who was truly in control. But his physical absence didn't mean he had relinquished command. Operated from exile.
With life-sized cutouts of their suspects in the background, authorities listed their fugitives.
In July 2023, as the Quebec Provincial Police issued public arrest warrants for Dave Turmel and his second-in-command Rubens Dennis, both men had already vanished without a trace. What investigators initially assumed was a temporary hideout strategy soon revealed itself as something far more sophisticated. Turmel hadn't just fled, he had established an international command center. Most fugitives either go completely dark or make mistakes trying to maintain control from afar, explained a cybercrime specialist who worked the case. Turmel somehow managed to continue directing operations with military-grade precision while constantly moving across continents. Cell phone data would later reveal an astonishing pattern of movement. Portugal, Morocco, Greece, Spain, and eventually Italy. At no point did Turmel use his real identity or established financial channels. He moved like a ghost, using a network of forged documents, cryptocurrency transactions, and burner phones that frustrated international law enforcement at every turn. More impressive than his evasion techniques was Turmel's continued operational control. Blood family mafia activities didn't slow during his absence, they expanded. Attacks on Hells Angels properties continued with precise timing. Drug shipments arrived on schedule. Money flowed through increasingly complex laundering operations, all orchestrated by a man who officially didn't exist anywhere. He was texting operational orders from across the Atlantic, and his people were executing them within hours, said a former RCMP intelligence officer. We intercepted fragments of communications showing he was micromanaging details down to specific street corners where deals would happen. It wasn't just broad directives, it was hands-on leadership from thousands of miles away. This remote command structure represented an evolution in organized crime that worried authorities. Traditional criminal organizations relied on physical presence and personal relationships. Turmel had created something different, a decentralized network that could function across borders with minimal direct contact, using encrypted technologies and disciplined cell structures that resembled terrorist organizations more than traditional gangs. The February 2024 coordinated raids across Quebec demonstrated the challenge. While authorities successfully arrested 18 BFM members and seized significant evidence, Turmel's core leadership remained intact and operations resumed within weeks. It wasn't until Rubens Dennis was captured in Lisbon that investigators began to understand the scope of what they were facing, finding in his possession notebooks referencing drop zones across multiple European countries. Even as the net tightened, Turmel maintained his operational rhythm. Some speculate he could have remained hidden indefinitely had it not been for an apparent betrayal from within his own organization. Someone lured by the $250,000 reward or seeking immunity provided coordinates leading to his Roman villa. What transformed Dave Turmel from a local gangster into a criminal legend was his unprecedented ability to maintain iron-fisted control over his organization while living as an international fugitive. When he vanished from Quebec in July 2023, most experts predicted the Blood family mafia would quickly fracture without its leader's physical presence. Instead, something remarkable happened. The organization not only survived, but thrived under his remote command. Most criminal organizations are built around personal relationships and face-to-face intimidation, explained a former RCMP intelligence analyst. They collapse without the physical presence of leadership. Turmel created something different, a criminal enterprise that functioned like a modern tech company, with secure digital communications, decentralized operations, and leadership that could work from anywhere. From his constantly shifting locations across Portugal, Morocco, Greece, and eventually Italy, Turmel maintained operational control through an elaborate system of encrypted communications. Intelligence gathered after his capture revealed he used a rotation of burner phones, specialized encryption software, and a complex system of code words and proxies to transmit orders. He was texting operational commands from across the Atlantic, and his crew was executing them within hours, said a Quebec provincial police officer familiar with the investigation. We'd intercept fragments of communications showing he was micromanaging everything from territorial disputes to specific assassination targets. This wasn't general guidance, it was hands-on leadership from thousands of miles away. What made this remote control particularly effective was Turmel's meticulous preparation. Before fleeing Canada, he had established a clear chain of command, with trusted lieutenants assigned specific responsibilities and territories. He created redundancy in his communication systems, ensuring that if one channel was compromised, others remained viable. Most importantly, he had instilled such fear and loyalty that his orders carried the same weight from 4,000 miles away as they would have in person. A former BFM associate who later entered witness protection described the process. Pick might be physically gone, but we felt his presence constantly. Messages would arrive with precise instructions, which corners to take over, which angels associate to target next, how to respond to police pressure. Disobeying wasn't an option, even with him overseas. Everyone knew he was watching, that he had eyes everywhere. This remote command capability represented a disturbing evolution in organized crime. Traditional criminal organizations were inherently limited by geography. Their influence diminished with distance. Turmel demonstrated that in the digital age, a criminal leader could project power globally while remaining physically untraceable. He essentially created a criminal cloud service, noted a cybercrime specialist. His physical location became irrelevant. His digital presence was what mattered, and that presence extended wherever his communications could reach. This is the future of organized crime, borderless, digitally native, and incredibly difficult to disrupt through traditional enforcement methods. The February 2024 coordinated raids across Quebec highlighted this challenge. While authorities successfully arrested 18 BFM members and seized significant assets, the organization's core infrastructure remained intact. Within weeks, operations had resumed under Turmel's continued remote direction. It wasn't until the capture of his second-in-command, Rubens Dennis, in Lisbon, that investigators began to understand the scope of his international command network. Even as the net tightened around him, Turmel maintained his operational rhythm. Some speculate he could have continued indefinitely had it not been for an apparent betrayal from within his organization. Someone lured by the $250,000 reward or seeking immunity who provided coordinates leading to his Roman villa. When Italian authorities finally entered that villa in March 2025, they found Turmel calmly waiting, barefoot in the hallway. Inside were the tools of his remote empire: forged passports, burner phones, encrypted USB drives, and handwritten codebooks mapping out operations across multiple continents. He had been living comfortably while orchestrating chaos from afar. His time in exile had achieved something remarkable. It had transformed the Blood family mafia from a local challenge into an international concern. More importantly, it had done lasting damage to the Hells Angels' reputation as the untouchable force in Canadian organized crime. Damaged Hells Angels' reputation.
30 of its files have led to arrests. Investigators say catching up to criminals is a community effort.
For nearly 3 decades following the Quebec Biker War, the Hells Angels had maintained an aura of invincibility across the province. Their dominance was so complete that most criminals simply accepted their authority without question. The 10% street tax was paid promptly, territorial disputes were settled by Angels' decree, and open challenges to their authority were virtually unheard of. Then came Dave Turmel. What Turmel did wasn't just challenge the Angels financially, he humiliated them publicly, explained a former prosecutor who specialized in organized crime cases. Every time a BFM attack went unanswered, every time Turmel's people took over another corner or flipped another dealer without immediate retaliation, the Angels' mystique eroded. The damage was particularly acute for the Quebec City chapter, which had long presented itself as the province's most disciplined and fearsome organization. As days turned to weeks and then months without a decisive response to Turmel's provocations, whispers began circulating throughout the criminal ecosystem. Perhaps the Angels weren't as powerful as everyone thought. A turning point came in late 2023 when several low-level drug dealers who had traditionally operated under Angels' protection began switching allegiance to the Blood family mafia. The flow of defectors started as a trickle, but grew steadily as Turmel's organization demonstrated it could both protect its people and punish enemies more effectively than the established power structure. The Angels had always sold themselves as the ultimate protection, said a street-level informant. "Pay us and we'll keep you safe." But when people saw the BFM torturing and killing Angels associates while the organization struggled to respond, that protection suddenly seemed a lot less valuable. Perhaps most damaging was the Angels' uncharacteristic willingness to negotiate. Multiple intelligence sources confirmed that by early 2024, representatives of the Hells Angels had made back-channel attempts to reach a territorial compromise with Turmel's organization, something previously unimaginable. The mere fact that they were willing to negotiate rather than wage all-out war represented a stunning loss of face. For younger criminals coming up in the system, the calculus changed, noted a police intelligence analyst. The Angels had always recruited by projecting an image of absolute power. Now there was an alternative model, younger, more tech-savvy, willing to use extreme violence, and apparently capable of outmaneuvering the old guard. By the time Turmel was captured in Italy, the damage to the Hells Angels' reputation was substantial and possibly permanent. Though they quickly moved to reclaim territories after the BFM leadership arrests, their mystique had been punctured. Other criminal organizations began testing boundaries, questioning tribute payments, and eyeing opportunities in markets previously considered untouchable. What began as one man's audacious refusal to pay a tax had evolved into a fundamental reshaping of Quebec's criminal landscape. And even with Turmel sitting in an Italian prison, the questions he raised continue to echo. If the mighty Hells Angels could be challenged so effectively by a young upstart with a different vision of criminal enterprise, what other changes might be coming to the underworld's established order. Started a movement.
C'est ce qui me permet aujourd'hui de vous confirmer que c'est bel et bien Dave Turmel qui a été arrêté en Italie.
C'est un point de presse qui était attendu de la part du chef de police du SPVQ qui a confirmé cet après-midi.
Dave Turmel didn't just challenge the Hells Angels, he sparked a revolution in Quebec's criminal underworld that continues to ripple through Canadian organized crime. What began as one man's refusal to pay taxes evolved into something much larger, a fundamental questioning of the old order that had governed illicit markets for decades. By late 2023, it wasn't just Turmel's blood family mafia refusing to pay, explained a Quebec provincial police intelligence analyst. Small crews across Montreal, Trois-Rivières, and even parts of Ontario were quietly testing the boundaries. They watched what happened to Turmel's organization and thought, if they can do it, why can't we? This wasn't just about money. The 10% tax the Hells Angels imposed had always been as much about respect and acknowledgement of hierarchy as it was about revenue. By publicly refusing to pay, Turmel challenged the fundamental social contract of Canadian organized crime, the understanding that certain organizations sat atop the pyramid and everyone else operated with their blessing. A former street dealer who switched allegiance to the BFM described the shift. It was like someone finally said what everyone was thinking. These old bikers sitting in their clubhouses, getting fat off our work while we took all the risks. Pick showed there was another way. What made Turmel's movement particularly potent was its appeal to younger criminals. While established crime families and biker gangs relied on tradition and reputation, the blood family mafia offered something different: meritocracy and modernity. They embraced cryptocurrency, used sophisticated encryption, and operated with a corporate efficiency that made the old guard look antiquated by comparison. Turmel created a narrative that resonated, said a criminology professor who studies gang recruitment. He positioned the BFM as the future and the Angels as the past. For young people entering the life, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds who felt excluded from traditional criminal hierarchies, that message was incredibly powerful. By early 2024, authorities identified at least 7 distinct criminal groups across Quebec that had adopted BFM-style tactics and organizational structures. These weren't direct affiliates, they were imitators, inspired by Turmel's model. They operated in smaller cells, maintained strict operational security, embraced digital technologies, and most importantly, rejected the traditional tribute systems. The movement's growth alarmed both law enforcement and established criminal organizations. Police resources were already stretched thin, tracking the original conflict between the BFM and Hells Angels. Now they faced multiple fronts as new groups emerged to fill power vacuums or challenge established territories. Perhaps most concerning for authorities was how Turmel's example had changed recruitment patterns. Traditionally, entry into organized crime followed predictable pathways: family connections, neighborhood affiliations, or apprenticeship under established figures. The BFM model bypassed these, allowing young criminals to form their own structures without permission from established powers. He democratized organized crime in a way we hadn't seen before, admitted one frustrated detective. Before Turmel, starting your own crew meant getting approval from someone higher up the chain. After him, kids realized they could just do it themselves if they were smart enough and brutal enough. Even with Turmel in custody, the movement he started continues to evolve. The ideology of independence he championed, that young criminals don't need to subordinate themselves to aging power structures, has taken root across Canada's criminal landscape. Some law enforcement officials privately worry that his capture may have transformed him from a criminal into a martyr, amplifying his influence rather than diminishing it. What makes the movement particularly resilient is that it isn't centralized around Turmel himself. It's based on his methods, his approach, his willingness to challenge convention, elements that can be replicated even without his direct leadership. And as his international manhunt demonstrated, the modern criminal doesn't need to be physically present to exert influence across borders and continents. International fugitive.
That is Quebec City Police Sunday morning confirming the criminal organization thereafter and the identity of the man running it. The blood.
When Dave Turmel vanished from Quebec in July 2023, few expected him to remain free for long. Canadian authorities mobilized one of the largest manhunts in recent history, placing him atop the BOLO Top 25 Most Wanted list with a staggering $250,000 reward. His face was plastered across border checkpoints, airports, and police stations nationwide. Yet somehow, Turmel slipped through the net and transformed from a local criminal into an international phantom. What made Turmel different from other fugitives was his preparation, explained a retired RCMP officer familiar with the case. Most criminals run reactively when heat builds up. Turmel had clearly planned his exit strategy months, maybe years in advance. By the time we issued the warrants, he was already operating with completely new identities across multiple countries. The first confirmed sighting came from Portugal in late 2023. Surveillance footage captured a man matching Turmel's description entering a luxury apartment building in Lisbon. By the time local authorities raided the location, he had disappeared again, leaving behind only a wiped laptop and scattered SIM cards. The next trace emerged from Morocco, where border officials later identified passport documentation that had been used by Turmel under an alias. The pattern continued: Greece, Serbia, briefly the Netherlands, then reportedly through parts of North Africa before settling in Italy. Each appearance was brief, each identity disposable. He moved like someone with intelligence training, noted an Interpol coordinator, multiple parallel identities, never using the same route twice, avoiding digital footprints, and leveraging cryptocurrency to move money without traditional banking channels. We were always 2 steps behind. What baffled investigators most wasn't just Turmel's ability to evade capture, but his continued operational control over the Blood family mafia. Encrypted communications intercepted by authorities revealed he was still giving specific orders, approving major moves, and even directing retaliatory strikes against Hells Angels' assets, all while moving across continents. The manhunt intensified in February 2024 when Canadian authorities executed coordinated raids across Quebec, arresting 18 BFM members. The hope was that someone would talk, providing information on Turmel's whereabouts in exchange for leniency. Instead, they encountered a wall of silence unprecedented in Canadian organized crime investigations. Not a single person cooperated, said a prosecutor involved in the case. We offered significant deals, reduced sentences, witness protection, new identities. They all refused. That level of loyalty or fear is extremely rare, especially when looking at serious prison time. The breakthrough finally came in February 2024 with the arrest of Rubens Dennis, Turmel's second-in-command, in Lisbon. While Dennis maintained his silence, the items recovered from his hotel room proved invaluable: a notebook containing coded references to locations across southern Europe, including specific districts in Rome. What followed was a carefully coordinated international operation involving Canadian authorities, Interpol, and Italian law enforcement. For weeks, they monitored potential locations, analyzed utility usage patterns, and deployed surveillance teams across Rome's outskirts. The endgame came through an unexpected channel, a cryptic message sent to a police contact in Quebec containing only coordinates and the phrase, "He's tired of moving." Whether this came from a disgruntled BFM insider or someone seeking the reward remains unknown, but the intelligence proved accurate. In the pre-dawn hours of March 27, 2025, Italian tactical units surrounded a private villa outside Rome. They expected resistance, perhaps even a firefight. Instead, they found Turmel standing calmly in a hallway, barefoot, seemingly expecting them. The man who had eluded international authorities for nearly 2 years surrendered without incident. Inside the villa, investigators discovered the infrastructure of Turmel's mobile command center. 6 burner phones, multiple SIM cards, forged documents from 4 countries, encrypted USB drives, and handwritten ledgers detailing operations across 2 continents. The technology was sophisticated, but what struck investigators most was the meticulous organization. Everything labeled, coded, and arranged with military precision. Turmel's capture made international headlines, but it also raised uncomfortable questions for law enforcement. How had someone so young, with no formal training in counterintelligence, managed to evade a multinational manhunt for so long? More concerning, what did it say about modern borders and identification systems that Turmel had crossed through at least 7 countries undetected? As he awaits legal proceedings in Italy's high-security Regina Coeli prison, Turmel's time as an international fugitive has only enhanced his mystique. For young criminals, his globe-trotting evasion of authorities represents something aspirational, proof that with the right preparation, even the most intense manhunt can be thwarted. That narrative is particularly powerful when contrasted with the aging leadership of traditional organizations like the Hells Angels, whose influence has historically been limited by geographical boundaries. Youth versus experience.
He was proud to be a Hells Angel, but he wanted more. He had a dream, the Hells Angels establishing themselves as Canada's only outlaw biker club. Sky, Pato's replacement, acknowledged Stadnik's effort and awarded him the Filthy Few patch, a high-status symbol that police believe the only way you could earn that patch is by killing for the club.
The conflict between Dave Turmel's Blood Family Mafia and the Quebec Hells Angels wasn't just a territorial dispute, it was a generational war. On one side stood an organization with nearly 50 years of history, established protocols, and aging leadership. On the other, a crew whose founder and most lieutenants were under 30, unburdened by tradition and hungry to rewrite the rules. The average age in the Quebec Hells Angels leadership was around 60, explained a criminology researcher specializing in biker gangs. Many were veterans of the 1990s biker war. They had decades of criminal experience, established networks, and a proven playbook. But that experience came with blind spots, particularly around technology and changing social dynamics. Turmel exploited these blind spots ruthlessly. While the Angels relied on traditional intelligence gathering through bar owners, strip club managers, and street informants, the BFM operated almost entirely through encrypted messaging apps, anonymous cryptocurrencies, and closed digital networks. They didn't hang out in known criminal haunts or socialize in predictable patterns. They moved like digital natives because that's exactly what they were. The Angels kept looking for Turmel in places young people don't go anymore, said a former street-level dealer. They'd send guys to check nightclubs, pool halls, restaurants. Meanwhile, BFM was coordinating through gaming servers and encrypted chats, meeting in Airbnbs rented under fake names, and moving money through channels the old guys barely understood. This generational divide extended to recruitment and loyalty models. The Hells Angels operated on an apprenticeship system. Prospects spent years proving themselves before earning full membership. Turmel's organization offered immediate opportunity based on skills and willingness to embrace extreme violence. For ambitious young criminals unwilling to wait years climbing traditional hierarchies, the appeal was obvious. A police intelligence report from early 2024 highlighted this contrast. BFM recruitment targets specifically focus on technical skills, encryption knowledge, social media manipulation, financial technology experience, areas traditional organizations have typically undervalued. Perhaps most significantly, the youth experience divide manifested in operational tempo. The Angels approached the conflict methodically, gathering intelligence before acting, weighing consequences, protecting established businesses. Turmel's crew moved with the impatience of youth, striking quickly, accepting casualties as a cost of doing business, and prioritizing psychological impact over long-term stability. The Angels were playing chess, thinking 5 moves ahead, noted a veteran organized crime detective. Turmel was playing speed chess, making 3 moves in the time it took them to make one. It wasn't always the optimal move, but the pace itself became a strategic advantage. This difference in pace repeatedly gave the BFM tactical advantages. When the Angels identified a BFM stash house and began planning a measured response, Turmel's people had already relocated their assets and set up elsewhere. When Angels leadership gathered to discuss strategy, BFM was already executing the next provocation. The conflict also exposed a stark reality about violence tolerance across generations. Many Angels leaders, comfortable after decades of relative dominance, had developed businesses and lifestyles they were reluctant to jeopardize with high-profile violence. Turmel's youth movement had no such reservations. They embraced extreme brutality precisely because it differentiated them from the established order. The older generation had developed a certain pragmatism, explained a former prosecutor. They understood that excessive violence brings heat, disrupts business, creates problems. Turmel's crew didn't care. They weaponized that difference, essentially betting that the Angels wouldn't match their brutality because they had too much to lose. That bet largely paid off. When the BFM dismembered victims or released torture videos, the Angels generally responded with more measured violence, drive-by shootings or disappearances rather than matching the theatrical cruelty. This restraint, while perhaps strategically sound, fed into the narrative that the old guard was weakening. As the conflict evolved, the generation gap became increasingly central to recruitment on both sides. Younger criminals increasingly viewed the Angels as outdated, overly cautious, and hierarchical. Meanwhile, established criminal figures gravitated toward the Angels' stability and business-focused approach. By the time of Turmel's capture, the criminal landscape had effectively segregated along generational lines, creating parallel power structures that continue to compete for influence. And while experience provides countless advantages in criminal enterprises, Turmel's youth movement demonstrated that in a rapidly changing world, adaptability and technological fluency can sometimes overcome decades of established practice. The generational warfare Turmel initiated extended beyond tactics to fundamental questions about how modern criminal organizations should operate. Questions that would soon be answered in the most graphic way possible as the BFM elevated the conflict to unprecedented levels of public brutality. Released torture videos.
Oh, I didn't record none of that. Do it again.
In the long history of Quebec's organized crime battles, certain lines had remained uncrossed. Violence was expected, even ritualized, but it typically occurred away from public view. Bodies might be found, but the acts that ended those lives remained mercifully private. Dave Turmel's Blood Family Mafia shattered this unwritten rule with a psychological warfare campaign that shocked even hardened criminals and veteran investigators. "We'd seen gang violence before," said a Quebec provincial police detective who requested anonymity. "Shootings, bombings, disappearances, that's standard in turf wars." But what the BFM did with those videos wasn't just violence, it was performance art designed to terrorize. The first video appeared in October 2023 on encrypted messaging channels frequented by drug dealers and criminal associates. It showed a man identified as a Hells Angels affiliate being subjected to systematic torture, waterboarded, burned with heated metal, his fingers broken one by one while he pleaded for mercy. The video wasn't brief or edited for impact. It ran for nearly 40 excruciating minutes. Most disturbing was the clinical atmosphere. The perpetrators wore surgical masks and gloves. The room was plastic sheeted like a kill room from a television crime drama. There was no rage, no shouting, just methodical, almost business-like infliction of suffering. At the video's conclusion, the victim was executed with a single gunshot. The final frame showed his Hells Angels tattoo being cut from his body. This wasn't about extracting information, explained a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case. The victim clearly had nothing valuable to offer. This was about creating a digital artifact of terror, something that would circulate, be watched, create fear. The production value alone suggested extensive planning. Within days, the video had spread through criminal networks across Quebec. Law enforcement intercepted dozens of messages referring to it, with many expressing shock at the escalation. What made the strategy particularly effective was the selective distribution. The video wasn't posted publicly online, where it might trigger massive police response, but in closed channels, where it would reach its intended audience. Anyone considering working with or for the Hells Angels. A second video appeared in December 2023. This one featured two victims, allegedly low-level drug dealers who had refused to switch allegiance from the Angels to the BFM. The torture techniques escalated: burning feet, partial drowning, ear and finger amputation. Again, the clinical approach, the high production value, the deliberate pacing designed to maximize psychological impact. These weren't just killings, noted a criminal psychologist. They were advertisements. Each video communicated the same message. This is what happens when you side against us, and more importantly, the Hells Angels cannot protect you from this fate. Law enforcement struggled to respond effectively. The videos were distributed through encrypted channels that made tracking the source nearly impossible. Forensic analysis revealed nothing useful about the locations. The rooms were generic, devoid of identifying features. The perpetrators never showed their faces or spoke identifiable phrases. By early 2024, at least 4 such videos had circulated through Quebec's criminal underground. Their impact on the conflict was profound. Multiple intelligence sources reported that low and mid-level criminals were actively avoiding association with the Hells Angels, fearing they might become the next unwilling stars in the BFM's grotesque film series. The Angels had always sold protection as their primary product, explained a former organized crime prosecutor. Pay us, follow our rules, and we'll keep you safe. These videos systematically undermined that promise. If the Angels couldn't protect their own people from such public, humiliating ends, what exactly were dealers paying for? Perhaps most disturbing was how the videos influenced recruitment patterns. While many were repulsed by the brutality, others, particularly younger, aspiring criminals, were drawn to the perceived power and fearlessness the videos represented. The BFM began attracting a particular type of recruit, those who viewed extreme violence not as a necessary evil, but as a calling card. We started seeing copycats, admitted a Montreal police officer, not full videos, but similar torture methods showing up in other gang conflicts. Turmel essentially normalized a level of brutality we hadn't seen before in Canadian crime. He made it aspirational. The psychological impact extended to law enforcement and prosecution. Cases involving the BFM became increasingly difficult to build as witnesses refused to testify, fearing similar fates. Even with significant protection offers, the visual impact of those videos created a chilling effect that standard witness protection couldn't overcome. The videos represented a fundamental shift in how criminal organizations projected power. Traditional organizations like the Hells Angels relied on reputation and history. Everyone knew what might happen if you crossed them, but that knowledge remained largely abstract. Turmel's innovation was making the threat explicit, undeniable, and impossible to unsee. This strategic use of documented torture created such pressure on the Hells Angels that it forced them into a position few thought possible, sitting down to negotiate with the upstart who had so publicly challenged their authority. Forced Hells Angels to negotiate. For nearly 3 decades, the Quebec Hells Angels had maintained an almost religious doctrine. They don't negotiate with challengers. Rivals were eliminated, not accommodated. Territories were taken, not shared. This inflexibility had been central to their mystique and power. Dave Turmel didn't just challenge this doctrine, he shattered it, forcing North America's most notorious biker gang into the unthinkable position of offering compromise. The first approach came through intermediaries in late 2023, revealed a former intelligence officer who worked the case. A neutral third party, a veteran criminal with connections to both sides but aligned with neither, carried messages between BFM lieutenants and the Quebec City Hells Angels chapter. The very existence of these communications was unprecedented. The Angels' willingness to negotiate rather than escalate stemmed from a cold calculation. The traditional response to Turmel's provocations would have been all-out war, targeted assassinations, bombings, a show of overwhelming force. But several factors complicated this approach. First was the asymmetrical nature of the conflict. The Angels had substantial businesses, properties, and public-facing operations that made them vulnerable to both BFM attacks and the increased police scrutiny that would follow a major gang war. Turmel's organization, by contrast, operated almost entirely in the shadows, with minimal fixed assets and leadership already accustomed to living underground. The Angels had something to lose, explained a veteran organized crime detective. Clubhouses, legitimate businesses, comfortable lives built over decades. Turmel's people lived like guerrillas, moving constantly, minimal possessions, ready to disappear at a moment's notice. It's hard to intimidate someone who has already embraced that lifestyle. Second was the generational reality. Many senior Hells Angels members were in their 50s and 60s, less inclined towards street battles than in their youth, and more focused on maintaining their criminal enterprises with minimal disruption. The prospect of trading violence with young, hungry criminals willing to dismember their enemies on camera had limited appeal. Most crucially, the Angels faced something they hadn't encountered in decades: defections from their protection racket. The BFM's brutal campaign had convinced a significant number of street-level dealers that Angels' protection wasn't worth the 10% tax, either because that protection was proving ineffective against Turmel's crew, or because paying it might actually make them targets. By early 2024, the Angels had a revenue problem, said a financial crimes investigator. Their Quebec City territory was seeing a 30 to 40% reduction in tribute payments. Dealers were either going independent, joining the BFM, or simply moving operations to areas with less conflict. The business model was under threat. The initial negotiations, according to multiple intelligence sources, centered on a territorial compromise, essentially dividing Quebec City into spheres of influence, with the Angels maintaining control over established areas while recognizing BFM authority in newer territories. This represented an extraordinary concession from an organization that had never acknowledged competitors as equals. These weren't friendly talks, clarified a source close to the negotiations. Both sides understood they were temporary, tactical adjustments. The Angels were playing for time, hoping law enforcement would solve their Turmel problem. The BFM was consolidating gains while their leader operated from overseas. The negotiations never resulted in a formal peace treaty. Violence continued sporadically throughout the period, with each side testing boundaries and responding to provocations. But the mere existence of dialogue represented a profound shift in Quebec's criminal power dynamics. For the first time in decades, the Hells Angels were treating a challenger as a force to be reckoned with, rather than an annoyance to be crushed. By the time Turmel was captured in Italy, the negotiations had established a de facto partition of certain territories and markets. The Angels maintained control over traditional strongholds, while BFM influence had solidified in areas they had specifically targeted, particularly neighborhoods with younger demographics and newer drug markets like synthetic opioids. What Turmel achieved wasn't just carving out territory, observed a criminology professor. He forced a generational reckoning within organized crime. The Angels had to confront the reality that their old playbook, overwhelming force, rigid hierarchy, traditional revenue models, might not work against modern challengers operating by different rules. The negotiation phase of the conflict revealed something few had anticipated. The Hells Angels, for all their fearsome reputation, had developed institutional inertia. Decades of dominance had made them adaptable in business, but rigid in conflict resolution. Turmel exploited this rigidity, creating problems the Angels' traditional methods couldn't easily solve. Perhaps the most lasting impact of these forced negotiations was their effect on the Angels' aura of invincibility. The message to the criminal underworld was clear: even the mighty Hells Angels could be brought to the bargaining table by sufficient pressure applied intelligently. That knowledge continues to reshape Quebec's criminal landscape even after Turmel's capture. As Dave Turmel sits in Regina Colie prison, awaiting whatever legal fate awaits him, his legacy isn't just the blood he spilled or the empire he built. It's the fundamental questions he forced upon North America's most established criminal organization. Can hierarchical, tradition-bound organizations survive in an era of decentralized networks? Can aging criminal enterprises adapt to challenges from digital natives who play by different rules? The answers remain unclear, but one thing is certain: the criminal underworld that existed before Dave Turmel will never be quite the same again.